Hello, and welcome to the WWF Conservation Insider Series, bringing you closer to the work that your support for WWF makes possible. My name is Will Garchor. I'm the Deputy Director for Legislative Affairs here at WWF, working with Congress to advance our policy priorities with the U.S. government. And I am honored to be your moderator here this evening. To start, I want to thank you all for your generous commitment to WWF. Together, we really are working together to create a brighter future for people, wildlife, and the planet. And like you, I am excited to be here tonight to talk with some of our key experts in WWF's work to protect the world's free-flowing rivers. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Michelle Thiem, Director of Freshwater Science and Ecosystems, and Catherine Blanchard, our Director of Freshwater Communications and Advocacy. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Will. It's a real pleasure to be here and be part of this Conservation Insider Series.
Great.
Thanks, Will. Excited for the conversation.
Of course. So today we're here to talk about WWF's freshwater program, and specifically your team's work on free-flowing rivers. Now, for most of us, when we think of free-flowing rivers, we probably imagine a river winding through some pristine landscape. Maybe we think of fishing or rafting through the rapids. I think of a sort of rough-hewn canyon that's probably been there for centuries, probably millennia, and is still getting carved away as the days go on. I think we were talking earlier, a good example would be the Salmon River in Idaho as an epitome of a free-flowing river in the United States. But most people may not realize that while we can still find these refuges in the U.S., less than 1% of America's rivers are protected and free-flowing under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which incidentally is having its 50th anniversary this very year. And the fact that so few of these rivers are protected is not good for species, right? In the US and Europe, where free-flowing rivers are scarce, fish species are going extinct at 100 times their natural rate. In fact, globally, freshwater species populations are declining at a rate of 81%, which is twice as fast as marine and terrestrial species. So today, we're going to talk about free-flowing rivers, the role they play for freshwater species, and what WWF is doing to protect them. So, Michelle, you're a freshwater scientist, and you have dedicated your career to help freshwater species and the rivers and lakes that they live in. So tell us, what exactly is a free-flowing river, and why are they so important?
Thanks, Will. Yeah, a free-flowing river is one that it flows naturally as it would, without any human alteration. And what this really boils down to is that the river remains connected in 4 key ways. It maintains upstream and downstream connectivity, and the most obvious blockage for this is dams. It disrupts the flows of sediment downstream to feed deltas and floodplains, and it disrupts the movements of fish and other organisms up and downstream. The second key way that rivers must maintain their connectivity is laterally. So the water needs to be able to move out onto the floodplain and back into the river. Oftentimes, levees are put in place that pin in rivers so that they can't move, so that cities or roads can be built in floodplains. And this blocks the movement, again, of sediments and water freely out onto the floodplain, and that feeds activities like floodplain farming, which is an important livelihood for many around the world. A third key way that rivers need to maintain connectivity is vertically. So water needs to be able to move down into the ground and down into aquifers. Aquifers act as reservoirs for future use of the river, and groundwater feeds the natural flow of rivers. And then the fourth key way that rivers need to be connected is in terms of temporally. So they need to be able to ebb and flow seasonally over time as they would. So there's 4 key ways are the upstream and downstream connectivity, the out and in onto the floodplain, and the vertical connectivity and seasonally over time. And this definition is grounded in science. Believe it or not, when we began this work several years ago, there was no scientifically agreed definition of what a free-flowing river was. So WWF led an effort bringing together McGill University as our main partner and 7 other universities as well as 3 other conservation organizations. We brought together scientists from all these groups to come up with a definition and also way to map where these free-flowing rivers exist around the world. And that work is now in review at a scientific journal, but it's resulted in this map that shows where the free-flowing rivers of the world remain. And this map is really key because it allows us to understand where these rivers are, where rivers are lost, where rivers still have long connectivity, and to track the status of these rivers over time. Mm-hmm. And the methods that have been developed can also be used not just for a global picture of what's going on, but they can be taken and downscaled and used in particular places, like we're doing in Zambia with better local data. And in Zambia, that map of free-flowing rivers is feeding into a process to identify water resource protection areas for the country, as well as to understand where those free-flowing rivers are and where the impacts of potential new dams on rivers would have the most impact.
Cool. So it sounds like these really are a sort of singular type of river with very special attributes. So in addition to the connectivity and the scientific definitions, what other kind of special attributes can we find with free-flowing rivers?
Yeah, sure. Happy to take that, Will. The bottom line is that free-flowing rivers provide us with so many more benefits than we typically think of when we picture a free-flowing river. And Michelle touched on a few. Floodplain farming, also that sediment that gets carried downstream to deltas, literally forming the ground beneath the feet of people who live there. So hugely important to people. But free-flowing rivers are also critical to iconic mammals and to entire landscapes. Tigers are a good example. In Nepal, studies are showing that certain dams could devastate the tiger population because these dams would then alter the floodplain habitat, which is critical for the species that the tigers prey upon. Without that prey, the tigers will be in trouble. Mm-hmm. In the Northwest US, Canada, Alaska, other studies have found that trees actually far from the river, high up on mountains, are fertilized by salmon. Oh, wow. And they're fertilized by salmon because, of course, the bears catch these fish in the river, take them deep into the woods to eat them, go to the bathroom, and there goes your trees. So you can start to see that these rivers, these really healthy connected river systems are critical to entire landscapes, to tigers, to people.
Yeah, that's actually pretty incredible that you can have impacts, that far away from, the river itself.
Exactly.
It's pretty amazing. So if these rivers are so important, then why are they disappearing?
Well, there's lots of ways that rivers can lose their connectivity from cities, from roads, and so on. But really, dams is the most important one. And the map that you see on the screen right now shows what's coming in terms of dams. And this is only the number of dams that we know are mapped. There are many, many more that are planned that we don't have the locations of them. But 3,700 dams are planned around the world, and they're shown in red on this map. And so we have a window of opportunity, really, where WWF and other organizations can come in and help to understand where our most critical rivers are, and so that we can put dams where the energy is needed, but also think about maintaining some of our river connectivity. There's a lot that's been learned, for example, in the US and Europe, where you saw earlier much of the map is red. And for example, we spend about $1 billion a year just to restore our rivers in the US. And it's led to efforts actually to start to take down dams. Mm-hmm. About 1,500 dams have been taken down in the US already, and Europe is following suit. So we also hear from developers and investors that they're seeing higher costs with project cancellations and delays due to the social and environmental risks associated with these dam projects. So we see a real opportunity for nations that still have a lot of river connectivity to kind of leapfrog forward and embrace new approaches to maintain their river connectivity and not suffer the financial and social environmental costs that have been happening in parts of the world.
So, of course, here at WWF, one of our other big priorities is combating climate change, which involves reducing carbon emissions and promoting renewable energy. And of course, hydropower is considered a key form of renewable energy. And so, how is it that we balance the need to promote those low carbon sources of energy with the need to protect free flowing rivers, both in the U.S. and around the world? How do you sort of balance out those two factors?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is really key. We know we need more dams, especially as we shift away from more carbon-intensive sources of energy. But we also recognize that there's an urgent need to figure out where our critical rivers are and to maintain those as well as meet our energy needs in a both renewable but also sustainable way. And so we're doing this the approach that we're taking at WWF is two-part. Part of it is around influencing this energy planning. So looking at the national or regional level, doing an analysis of how energy needs can be met in a way that includes other alternatives such as solar and wind, not just hydropower, and mapping out what that looks like, and then seeing what is the minimum amount of hydropower that is needed, and then helping countries to identify where the sites are that are least damaging for hydropower for that minimum amount that's needed.
Right.
And then the second piece of this is really looking at where those critical free-flowing rivers are and putting in the policies and legal protections to protect them, and also in certain cases standing up and advocating against bad dams that we know will be really damaging for people and wildlife.
Right. And so how are we working on that aspect, that renewable versus sustainable thing, and communicating that with the public?
Yeah, a big part of it is education.
Yeah.
You know, people still, many people still think that renewable is sustainable,
Right.
and that's not necessarily the case. And many people don't know about all these other benefits that free-flowing rivers bring us. And so one of the things that we've done under this program is create WWF Free Rivers, which is the first ever environmental science augmented reality app. It's very cool.
That sounds very cool.
And basically it means that through your device, you can bring a river basin into your living room and you can interact with it as you would a tabletop model. And the story that goes along with this app is really helping people discover how rivers do help people and wildlife. And it also allows you to play with wind and solar energy as well as dams and seeing the impacts and benefits of each of those options. And the bottom line is that we can have development and keep free-flowing rivers. And this is really the message that we want to send people, that we can do both. It's not either or. And so with this app, we're trying to bring it into classrooms, educate the people who will manage river basins in the future, as well as in boardrooms and meeting rooms with current investors and developers, and even out into the field and showing riverside communities that hydropower isn't necessarily the best option to bring them the energy that they need.
And what more can you say about that, where we're implementing in the field? Do you have some examples that you can discuss?
Yeah, sure. One of the best examples, I think, is the Luangwa River, which is one of the last long free-flowing rivers in southern Africa. It is the epitome of a wild river. I mean, you can't step out of the hotel room without seeing elephants and giraffes and hippos and lions and all this other wildlife, birds. It's absolutely amazing. And the river itself is wild. It really does what it wants. In the rainy season, it carves a new path. You really can't predict where it's going to be year by year. And in the dry season, it leaves behind these little oxbow lakes, these tiny watering holes that sustains that wildlife throughout the year. And of course, the river is critical for all the people that live alongside it, for fishing, for their livelihoods. Floodplain farming is big there, for drinking water. So it's hugely important. Foreign investors have proposed a dam for the Luangwa, which just makes no sense at all. It's a seasonal river, or a temporal river, so the energy wouldn't be consistent from this dam. It's very sediment rich, so that would be very bad for the mechanisms of the dam. It would really just doesn't make sense. So we are working with local communities on the ground to fight that dam, to do some of the advocacy that Michelle mentioned. And we're actually supporting that also with a global campaign. So after this webinar, please log on and sign your name to our Luangwa petition. Because we're really trying to show the government of Zambia that this river is important and should remain free-flowing. Part of the ask is also on this legal protection mechanism. So we are trying to designate the river as a water resource protected area, which would keep it healthy and well-connected far into the future. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we are trying to work with the government to identify where dams do make sense for Zambia. And also what solar and other options could look like as the country looks at its whole energy portfolio and tries to bring power to these rural communities.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you're pointing out a really clear and important connection between the work we're doing on the freshwater front with the work we're doing on, for example, the wildlife front, and even dovetails with my work on the policy front, where, you mentioned we're talking about Zambia, which is part of the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, or KAZA, as we say, to shorten that up a bit, which, we're putting a lot of energy into working there. It is home to 50% of Africa's remaining African elephants, as well as other endangered large mammals. And of course, at the heart of that landscape, which is the largest transfrontier conservation area in the world, you have the Okavango Delta, right, which is being fed by the Okavango River, which gets its origins up in the highlands of Angola, although the delta is in Botswana, right? And so you're now seeing proposals to develop those upper reaches of the river with hydropower and other potential developments that could threaten that ecosystem at the far end, which is probably one of the more spectacular places to see wildlife on the planet, right? And a big driver of economic activity and growth for Botswana and other surrounding countries. And so there's an effort through some legislation to get the U.S. government to work with these countries to encourage protection of the river and the development of community-based conservation approaches like we've done in Namibia and elsewhere to try and say invest in conservation as an economic driver and don't sacrifice these assets to, for example, short-term thinking around hydropower development, do it right, So it's kind of that intersection of all these pieces of our work that's pretty cool. Now that we've got a good example of where we're working, what can you say about successes that we've seen so far? Give us some examples of those.
Yeah, sure. I can start on the protection side. So the list of dams stopped by public outcry is pretty short.
Yeah.
But they do exist. We've got case studies where public movements, where advocacy campaigns have stopped dams in the US and Australia, in the Balkans, in Southeast Asia. And we're hoping that some of the dams we're trying to stop will make it to that list. But additionally, on the legal mechanisms on that policy side, we have a couple cool wins, including one just a couple weeks ago on June 5th, World Environment Day. The Mexican government signed a number of decrees protecting certain rivers as water reserves. Mm-hmm. A water reserve is based in science, so a lot of thorough study on how much water is needed within a river to maintain the function of that ecosystem so that the water can continue to produce, the river can continue to produce water. Mm-hmm. And based on that, the government then allocates at least that percentage of water of the river for nature, so making sure that the system can continue. And these water reserves, which are protecting about half of Mexico's rivers, some of them will ensure that the remaining free-flowing rivers stay healthy, connected, flowing along into the future. One example is the Usumacinta. Forgive my poor Spanish pronunciation, where over 90% of the river's water is allocated for nature. It's reserved for nature. And that means that, yes, there will still be water available for the local indigenous communities and a couple other activities, but for the most part, this river, which is the most biodiverse river in Central America, will continue to flow as it currently does, even as the climate changes, even as increased demands come up.
Yeah.
And so we're very excited to see this kind of protection take place.
Wow, cool. Anything else on the energy side?
Yeah, and on the alternative energy side, so we've been working in Myanmar with our team there has been working with the government on feeding information into an evaluation of their hydropower planning for the future. And it's not finalized yet, but the draft plan that just came out has identified one of the major recommendations to be to keep the main stems of the Salween and the Irrawaddy rivers, which are the two longest free-flowing rivers that remain in Southeast Asia, free and open. So if that happens, if it comes to fruition, that'll be a huge win for us. And we've also developed alternative energy vision for that country, which is providing some basis for how much can be supplied by solar and wind energy versus other hydropower and so on.
Very cool. Well, I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation, but I'm mindful that our friends on the web and on the phone may also have questions of their own. So this question is from Mark in Washington. Michelle mentioned that river water needs to flow into the aquifer. What is the physics that prevents a healthy river from losing all of its water to the aquifer and going dry?
Okay, great question. Well, it really depends on the local context, but in most cases, the volume of water that's flowing through a river is so much that only a portion of it will go into the aquifer due to the friction associated with the subsurface sediments and so on.
Interesting. I hadn't really thought of that question before. Why doesn't the river just disappear into the ground?
Exactly.
Right? So-
That does happen in some cases.
Does it
but
really?
yes.
Okay, all right. That's fascinating. Did you want to add anything to that, Kathy?
I was just going to say, one of the things that strikes me is the opposite is true also. If we take too much water from our aquifers, if we deplete then the river water does actually sink more into that groundwater, and that is how we lose water, our rivers. So it does happen. We've seen some cases of that in the Southwest U.S.
Wow.
Near Albuquerque, especially, where we've drained a lot of aquifers.
Interesting. So our next question is from Carol in Colorado. And Carol's question is, are there any rivers in Colorado, California, or elsewhere in the U.S. that are in need of conservation aid?
I would say that almost every river on the planet is in need of conservation aid. I mean, one of the problems is that we take our rivers for granted, and we think of them as nothing more than obstacles to bridge or drains where we can throw things that we don't want for them to be taken away, or energy to tap through hydropower. And so our rivers around the world really are in trouble. In the U.S., one of the rivers where we're really focused is the Rio Grande. Now, back before there was a lot of development in the U.S., the Rio Grande flowed as this big, mighty river all the way from Colorado along the U.S.-Mexican border to the Gulf of Mexico. It was so wide and deep, there were these huge barges, like shipping was an economic activity, and there were even sturgeon, like these massive migratory fish swimming up and downstream. Now the Rio Grande dries up past El Paso. It's just a trickle.
It's crazy.
And it does get some recharges here and there from tributaries in Mexico, but most years it doesn't reach the Gulf at all. And it really is the epitome of the challenges our rivers face around the world. There's agriculture, there's industry. We have fragmented this river through the development of hydropower dams and other infrastructure. And we at WWF are now really focused on trying to restore the parts of the river that still can provide critical ecosystem services, critical habitat for monarchs and other iconic species. And yeah, are very excited of doing that. But there are a lot of rivers that need a lot of help in the US and around the world.
Yeah. So our next question is from Damon in Texas. What can be done in places that have dams already?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, the ultimate answer is eventually to take out a dam. And you can reach that when you get to a place where the cost of having that dam in place outweigh the benefits.
Right.
That can be on a social, financial, functional loss in the system, or it can be economic as well. So that's one choice that can be made. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a choice that's being made increasingly in places like the US and Europe. But there are also other things that you can do in the way you operate a dam so that you release flows at the time of year that they would naturally be going down the river. I mean, it doesn't change the fact that you have this blockage in the river, so that upstream, downstream connectivity is still lost, but it does help with the other aspects of connectivity that I mentioned that are associated with the flow of the river and the water that's flowing downstream from it.
Right.
So there's some level of functionality that can be restored to the river by putting in place these flows. We call them environmental flows associated with a dam.
Right, but nothing can really replace taking the dam away in the end, right? So our next question is from Anne-Marie in Minnesota. This is a big problem that WWF can't solve alone. Who else is working on this, and is WWF working together with them? So who are we partnering with in this work?
Sure. Michelle mentioned that the foundation of this work really was in partnership with many other academic institutions and other organizations, and so it's important to remember that this was built in partnership. But we are always exploring partnerships with like-minded institutions. So Patagonia is a good example. They're very adamantly talking about this issue of free-flowing rivers and dam removal, and we do partner with them, particularly in Europe, where our campaigns are very much overlapping. And we've seen some of their communications share our messages, which is wonderful for us to see. We're also big fans of American Rivers here in the US,
Right.
where they're doing a lot of advocacy to expand wild and scenic protections here. And that's another very exciting campaign to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of their bread and butter, right?
That's it.
No, and we partner with many NGOs on a range of, I can't think of actually many issues that we don't have partners in our community on, right? Because as the questioner said, we can't do it all. We're big, but we're not that big. The next question we have is from Chris in Oregon. Is WWF against dams completely? If so, how does this sync with a low carbon future? So a little bit what we touched earlier, but this notion of, are we anti-dam?
Yeah. No, our policy is clearly not anti-dam.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of debate within WWF about this, and we decided that that was not the stance that was appropriate for us. And so we think, however, that there are right places, or there are better places in a river system if you're going to put a dam that are going to have less impacts ecologically for the freshwater system. And so we definitely advocate for that.
Yeah. I recall, this is going back a ways, but there was a Senate hearing on issues around this in the Mekong Delta, and our expert at the time testifying up in the Senate about the fact that, it's about where you put it. It's not about whether you have it, but like the main stem is not the place to be doing this. And so how do you make those kinds of trade-offs without saying no entirely?
Yeah,
correct?
exactly.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, here we go. One from David in Florida. Aside from supporting WWF financially, which we love it when you do, what else can I do to support WWF's efforts to protect free-flowing rivers? We touched a little bit on our advocacy petition, but what other kind of things can folks do?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that education piece. So trying to help spread this message that hydropower isn't necessarily a sustainable solution. It really has to be done well in order to be sustainable. And so getting involved and making sure that people are aware of this distinction. The other thing is that we do have a freshwater force here at WWF US. You can sign up in the same place where the Luangwa petition is available. And that's sort of our reaction team, our squad, where when there are rivers in troubles, we contact that team to sign the petitions, rally, do river cleanups, whatever the particular call of action is, so that you can be a part of this bigger process on behalf of rivers, keeping rivers healthy and connected.
So if you sign up for the freshwater force, do you get a cool costume to wear?
Including a mask and a cape.
Excellent.
Just kidding.
I didn't know this existed. I'm going to go on right when we're finished and just sign up right away. So. Our next question is from Cecilia in Virginia. I have heard WWF talk a lot about efforts in the Pantanal lately. Can you tell me more about this and how it's related to WWF's free-flowing rivers work? The Pantanal. So tell us, what is the Pantanal and what is our work in the Pantanal?
Okay, thanks, Cecilia.
Yes.
Great question. So the Pantanal is the world's largest tropical wetland. It's in the heart of South America, shared by Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay. And it's this really amazing, intricate system that sort of acts like a sponge for the region, where it absorbs the water in the rainy season, holds on to it, and then releases it slowly in the dry season, sustaining people and wildlife, including the iconic jaguar. It's a really beautiful place that currently is still pretty pristine, still pretty intact. But development is a major threat there and could put the whole system at risk. So there are some dams planned.
Yeah, there's about 100 dams planned in the headwaters of the Pantanal. So if all of those dams are built out, it's really going to put this kind of functionality of the system that Catherine described at risk.
It sounds similar to what we were talking about with the Okavango, actually, where you've got this amazing inland wetland that's really reliant on these rivers. Otherwise, it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's it.
So we've been working with the governments to help them come up with this landmark, or supporting them as they came up with this landmark declaration to protect the Pantanal and co-manage it as 3 countries, which is an amazing thing. I mean, it's rare that you see countries so proactively collaborating on water resources across borders, and it's also rare to see countries really embrace nature as part of their development planning. And these 3 countries are doing both of those things for the Pantanal. So we're very excited about that and anticipate that part of it will include some of this work on the right dams in the right place and what other kind of energy sources can we bring in to keep that Pantanal system healthy and functioning.
That's great. And as you sort of hint at, when you get these countries working together around shared natural resources in these transboundary areas, it's actually a peace and security plan as well. Oftentimes, cooperation first comes around things like shared natural resources, and that leads to building those kinds of relationships in places, not just in Latin America but elsewhere. So we have time for one more question, and that question is from Nick in Nebraska. How are free-flowing rivers impacted by climate change?
Yeah,
it's an easy one to.
So free-flowing rivers, like all rivers, are being impacted by climate change as we're seeing changes in precipitation and in temperature. So precipitation changes drives changes in runoff and discharge, and the timing of those and the magnitude, as well as changes in water temperature are coming. And so free-flowing rivers are really important in this context because having that river connectivity in a changing climate allows for species and habitats to move, and move into refuges that they wouldn't necessarily be able to move into if that connectivity is lost.
Yeah, I know. I imagine if you dam a river and then the conditions change and species can't migrate past that point, then you're essentially stuck and there's nowhere else to go. So it's much like, you can't go beyond the top of a mountain, right? And so species have to migrate upwards. And complicated issue, and of course has impacts on communities as well, because it changes how dams work, because you can no longer, all that planning of decades worth of what can we expect from a river goes out the window if all the precipitation patterns change, right?
Yeah.
Well, cool. I think that this is a great place to wrap up today's conversation. So on behalf of WWF, thank you for joining us and for supporting our efforts to protect the future of nature and all living things. Have a great evening. Thank you, ladies.
Thank
you.